Well, we've been looking at global conversation initially on Twitter about how people communicate with each other around the 16 topics of the development agenda. And of course, that turns out to be in ways that are very different than how people talk about these topics in a policy context. People are talking about how lack of access to health care, good education, clean water affects their lives. And it's messy, subjective, perceptual human conversation. What we find, of course, is that you have a lot more color, you have a lot more nuance, you see a lot more relationships between and across topics. And I think there's a lot of potential to understand the context in which people talk about different aspects of these topics that can really help us understand what's important globally, what's important to specific populations, to men versus women in country A, country B. I think that paying attention to how people are talking about these issues in their own natural language, in their own idiom, in their own online conversations publicly with one another is really, really critical to making sure that we're aiming at the right targets. I think one of the key issues is sort of what is the specific scenario where you're looking at online conversation, because there may be cases where you can throw a stone into the water and count the ripples that come back. I mean, social media as one of these big data sources is not simply a big database for us to analyze. It's a new digital landscape through which we're able to engage with populations around the world, which means this is an interaction medium. And so we should be really thinking about these capabilities in that way. We can listen, but we can also focus the conversation. We can spark a topic, and we can really get higher quality signals coming back in a way that's explicitly recognized. Our hope with the post-2015 dashboard was to actually create a mirror where you could really have focused global conversation around these topics, and then let people see the real-time distillation of what they're saying collectively. But there'll be other cases where you'd have to worry about people gaming the system, right? Once as people are aware that this conversation is being used to shape policy, that does drive engagement, but that can also create scenarios where people are more or less likely to try to manipulate it. This is why the representativeness and the volumes of the data start to matter a great deal. If it's only 10 people talking about a topic, it's easy to recruit 10 people to report something false. It's a lot harder to get 100,000 to do so, and to talk about it in ways publicly for which they could be held accountable later. So we are thinking about the topic, but we're not there yet. But you can also filter the conversation, right? So you can also remove accounts that don't have a certain number of followers and so forth. It's also the case that there have been some studies of Twitter conversation around true topics versus false topics. If some number of people on Twitter know that a piece of information that's being pushed is false, they start denying it very quickly, and so the signal of a piece of known false information decays very quickly. You see a drop in the number of retweets, for example. You don't see that in a piece of information that is known to, which is not known to be false. So there's some, journalists are already figuring this out, and there's a lot we can build on there. Well, I think a lot of the privacy conversation today is really a legal conversation about rights to privacy and understanding the liability of companies and how they handle consumer data. But I think you have to take things a step further as we look at this in the development context. It's fine and good to be able to understand the risk of re-identification of someone from a data set. But then you also have to think of the potential for abuse of that information once re-identification has occurred. And there, the risk modeling is completely different. If you can re-identify someone in a way that, for example, identifies them in terms of their ethnicity, in terms of their religion, in terms of their sexual orientation, and then you're dealing with a particular context where there's high potential for discrimination based on that re-identification, then you're dealing with very clearly a human rights issue. This isn't merely a privacy issue. So I think the point here is that we have to develop frameworks to understand how data can be shared, how it can be processed, how it can be used in ways that maximize utility and minimize the risk of creating new vulnerabilities for the same populations that we're hoping to help. There are not a lot of standards in this space around sharing of different types of data. There are not a lot of standards around anonymization of many of these data sources. There are great standards in healthcare, for example, around medical records and health information, but around financial transactions and calling patterns and search behavior and some of these other new big data sources, we need regulatory frameworks. We need data standards. We need to come together as a global community and figure out how to turn big data into a genuine public good. Well, it's a very new space, and part of the challenge is there aren't a lot of end-to-end examples. This is a major focus of Global Pulse, is actually trying to build that base of evidence. What there's been is a lot of academic research showing the potential of the data sources, but not a lot of examples of operational success. There's a pretty well-known case where FlowMinder was able to extract information on population displacement in Haiti following the earthquake and make this information available so that it could be used to predict where cholera outbreaks were likely to spread to next. If you see that a certain number of people have been displaced to a nearby town from an area where there was already cholera, that's probably where you should look for targeting your interventions next. In the work that we're doing right now, we're just at the stage where we're engaging with development and humanitarian agencies to look at how we can pilot some of these new approaches, being able to see where parents aren't vaccinating their children and why, being able to see where people have less money to spend on mobile communications, for example, being able to understand where people are talking more about smoking or drinking, not exercising could be useful for understanding the risk of non-communicable diseases, being able to understand where people don't show any awareness of how you contract HIV can be very useful for targeting programs. So there's a lot of signal and there are a lot of methodologies. What we need now is evidence of end-to-end success. I think in general, if we imagine the world in 10 years, some of the information that's currently collected through surveys is not going to be collected through surveys. Surveys will not be the optimal tool. Not just because of the frequency in which surveys can feasibly be implemented, but also just because there's plenty of real-time information out there that could be used for higher frequency and much more cost-effective data collection. So commodity price tracking, for example. If enough businesses are advertising prices online and enough people are talking online about what they paid for an item, you can extract that information in real time. Surveys make no sense. But at the same time, if you look at kind of official statistics, that data is used primarily for long-term planning. Now, even though the world moves faster today, long-term planning as a concept isn't going away. Here at the EU, we're looking at 7-year plans, and that kind of approach is going to persist. But what's important is to be able to get real-time feedback on when your implementation of a program at the country level is getting off track, where you're no longer on plan. And that's where big data, I think, is going to be extremely complementary. Surveys give you that high-resolution picture as you start your program, but then you can use this by the analogy with video, you can use continuous monitoring passively using these big data approaches to see if your livelihoods program isn't working, to see if disease prevalence isn't dropping, and take corrective action to get your program back on track. I think as we look at the emerging list of indicators for the post-2015 agenda, I think it's worth thinking about, which of these would be improved by increasing the frequency? Right? So commodity prices, if we can get those day by day, that would be great. You can see a net improvement that's better than weekly or monthly. Unemployment numbers on a daily basis probably doesn't add value. So being able to understand where we should target our innovation work in using big data is really the first priority. I think operationally, we're talking about bringing new processes into organizations that can be driven by real-time feedback, but not necessarily replacing all of the pre-existing processes. This is something we've got to learn empirically. Once the data is available, we've got to learn where it makes sense to use it and where it doesn't. No one makes a long-term plan based on a Twitter post, right? you have to figure out what the right time scale is for that type of work. Our long-term vision is to accelerate global adoption of these approaches, which means that long-term global pulse as such will not need to exist. Our success for us is institutions at the country level, at the global level, adopting into practice big data innovation to improve how they operate. Now that said, there's a second aspect to Global Pulse as well, which is we're a public sector innovation lab. And I think that having a lab-based approach to staying ahead of the curve is something that does need to persist. We want to see that model adopted, again, by national governments, within government ministries, by UN agencies, international organizations, and we would hope to see that persist over time. I would hope 10 years from now that we've moved on from big data, and big data has become part of how institutions make decisions. It's become a way to empower individual citizens, but that the institutions themselves are now operating in a way that recognizes that in a fast-changing landscape, you have to build to learn. You have to prototype, you have to try, you have to experiment with things that didn't exist 30 days ago. One of the ideas that's got us really interested is the idea of looking at a data source that's not currently considered to be big data, but could be turned into big data in real time, and that's radio conversation. People all across sub-Saharan Africa, for example, are on the radio, and they're calling in to radio stations and talking about what's happening in their communities. They're texting in. We see an opportunity to build tools that can transcribe these public conversations, very analogous to Twitter, and online news, these public conversations into a text transcript that could then be analyzed, so you could see where people are talking about flooding, where they're talking about rising food prices, where they're talking about the symptoms of dengue fever. This could provide whole new insights in areas where you don't have a lot of internet penetration, where you don't have a lot of social media usage. We could suddenly get text, and that would be very exciting. What's happening increasingly is that radio in developing economies is being streamed. And we're seeing a lot of that happening because those who produce radio programs, at the provincial level, know that a lot of the former residents of that province are now working in a nearby city, and they want people to be able to keep in touch with what's happening locally. So content is made available in MP3 format, and people can call into the shows and respond. There's a lot of content, like all big data, just being produced passively. It doesn't have to be actively collected. We're not using it.